Tonight, like every night, the faithful had gathered. Mrs. Curie, a widow who had tended the shrine for 20 years, arranged fresh roses at the statue's base. Father Elias from St. Anthony's Church stood nearby, chatting warmly with Imam Hassan from the mosque 3 blocks over. This was their routine, a small but powerful symbol of coexistence in a town that prided itself on interfaith harmony. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps on stone. Karim Al-Fahd emerged from the shadowed arcade, a red plastic gasoline canister swinging from his right hand. At 38, he cut an imposing figure with his thick black beard, his pressed white thobe, and eyes that burned with absolute certainty. Those who knew him described him as intense, intelligent, uncompromising. He ran a fabric shop on the eastern edge of the market, and in recent years had become something of a minor celebrity on social media, where his videos critiquing what he called the corruption of pure monotheism had garnered thousands of views. He had warned them, on his YouTube channel, in sermons at smaller prayer gatherings, in heated debates outside coffee shops. He had spoken of the dangers of idol worship creeping into the community, but his warnings had fallen on deaf ears, or worse, had been dismissed with patronizing smiles and calls for tolerance. Tonight, he would make them understand. "Get back!" he shouted as he approached the statue, his voice cutting through the evening chatter like a blade. People turned confused. Mrs. Corey clutched her rosary. Father Elias stepped forward, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Karim, my friend, what are you?" But Karim was already unscrewing the canister's cap. The sharp smell of gasoline filled the air as he raised it high and poured the liquid over the statue in great splashing waves. The amber fuel ran down Mary's serene face, soaking into the cedar grain pooling at the pedestal's base. "This is shirk," Karim declared, his voice trembling with righteous fury. "This is the worship of creation instead of creator. We cannot allow this blasphemy to stand in the heart of our community." "Please, brother, stop!" Imam Hassan rushed forward, his face pale with shock. "This is not our way. This is not Islam." But Karim had already pulled a lighter from his pocket. The small flame danced in the gathering darkness as he held it aloft, his hand steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "Idolatry has no place here," he said, his voice suddenly quiet, almost tender, as if he were performing an act of mercy. Then he dropped the flame. "Before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit hype to boost this episode. Drop a comment below with your city or country. I'm always curious where viewers are joining from." The fire caught with a sound like a great inhalation of breath. Flames raced up the statue's robes, consuming the aged cedar with terrifying speed. The heat drove the crowd back, their horrified screams rising into the night sky. Orange light danced across the surrounding buildings, casting grotesque shadows that writhed and twisted like living things. Mrs. Corey collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Father Elias stood frozen, his face illuminated by the inferno, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Imam Hassan grabbed Karim by the shoulders, shaking him, demanding to know what madness had possessed him. Karim shook him off and walked away, his back straight, his stride purposeful. Behind him the Virgin burned. Cell phones captured every moment, the footage already being uploaded, shared, going viral before the first fire truck even arrived. By the time the flames were extinguished, nothing remained but a blackened skeleton of wood and the acrid smell of smoke that would linger in the square for days. The pedestal stood empty, a monument to something precious that had been destroyed in an instant of zealous fury. The news spread through the town like wildfire itself. By midnight the story had reached national media. By dawn it had gone international, and Karim Al-Fahd, who had thought he was defending the purity of faith, had no idea that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would bring him to his knees in ways he could never have imagined. Morning came harsh and unforgiving. Karim woke in his bed above the fabric shop, reaching instinctively for his phone. 347 notifications. His WhatsApp groups were exploding. His Facebook page had been flooded with comments. His YouTube channel had gained subscribers overnight, but the messages were not words of support. "Terrorist. Extremist. You've destroyed everything we've built here. May Allah forgive you, because we cannot." He scrolled through the messages with growing unease, his coffee growing cold in his hand. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Where were the voices of reason? Where were those who understood that he had acted to preserve the integrity of monotheism? His wife, Aisha, moved quietly in the kitchen below, preparing breakfast for their 2 children. She hadn't spoken to him since he'd returned home last night, hadn't met his eyes, hadn't asked him why. The silence between them was louder than any accusation. When he finally descended the stairs, she was standing at the stove, her hijab neatly pinned, her back rigid with tension. 7-year-old Layla sat at the table, pushing her eggs around her plate. 15-year-old Ahmed had his headphones on, staring at his own phone, his jaw tight. "Aisha," Karim began, but she held up a hand without turning around. "The landlord called," she said, her voice flat. "He wants us out by the end of the month." "What? He can't do that. We have a lease." "He can do whatever he wants." She finally turned to face him, and he was shocked by the exhaustion in her eyes. "You burned a holy statue in the middle of the town square, Karim. On camera. What did you think would happen?" He opened his mouth to explain, to make her understand the theological imperatives that had driven him, but Ahmed suddenly yanked off his headphones and stood up so violently that his chair toppled backward. "Do you know what they're saying at school?" his son demanded, his voice cracking with adolescent fury and shame. "Do you know what they're calling me? I can't show my face there. I can't—" His voice broke, and he ran from the room, his footsteps thundering up the stairs. Layla began to cry, soft hiccuping sobs that tore at Karim's heart. He reached for his daughter, but Aisha intercepted, scooping the girl up and holding her close. "Go open the shop," she said quietly. "If we're going to survive this, you need to work." The walk to the fabric shop had never felt longer. Every person he passed either looked away or stared with naked hostility. Old Mrs. Habib, who had bought cloth from him for her daughter's wedding, crossed to the other side of the street. The young men who usually gathered at the corner cafe to smoke and talk politics fell silent as he approached, their eyes following him with expressions he couldn't quite read. When he unlocked the shop's metal shutters and rolled them up, his heart sank. Someone had spray-painted words across his display window in dripping red letters. "Hate has no home here." He stood there for a long moment, staring at the vandalism, trying to summon the righteous anger that had fueled him the night before. But all he felt was a growing sense of unease, like standing on ground that was slowly giving way beneath his feet. The shop remained empty all morning. Usually, by 10 o'clock, he'd have served a dozen customers, discussing fabrics and patterns, sharing tea, conducting the social commerce that was as much about community as profit. Today, not a single person crossed his threshold. At noon, he walked to the mosque for dua prayer, as he had done 5 times a day for most of his adult life. But when he arrived, Imam Hassan was waiting at the entrance. "Karim," the Imam said gently, placing a hand on his arm, "perhaps it would be better if you prayed at home for a while." "You're banning me from the mosque?" "Not banning, asking. Please understand, brother. The community is wounded. Many of our Christian neighbours feel betrayed. Some are even questioning whether we truly seek peace with them. Your presence here right now would only inflame tensions." "But I was defending Islam," Karim protested, his voice rising. "I was standing against—" "You were standing alone," Imam Hassan interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "The Prophet, peace be upon him, taught us to respect the people of the book. Mary, peace be upon her, has an entire surah named after her in our Quran. What you did last night, that was not Islam, Karim. That was pride dressed in piety." The words hit Karim like physical blows. He wanted to argue, to cite verses and hadith, to prove that his actions had been justified. But Imam Hassan had already turned away, returning to the mosque where the call to prayer was beginning. Karim stood on the street, listening to the familiar melody of the adhan, barred from the very building where he had sought to preserve religious purity. He prayed alone on the sidewalk, passers-by giving him a wide berth. The afternoon brought more isolation. His social media accounts were suspended. His supplier called to say they would no longer be doing business with him. The local newspaper published an editorial condemning the attack, with quotes from community leaders of all faiths denouncing violence and vandalism. Even his friends, his brothers in faith who had once eagerly shared his videos and nodded along with his critiques, now sent brief, cold messages. "What you did was wrong, Akhi. I can't be associated with this. May Allah guide you to wisdom." By evening, Karim sat alone in his shop, surrounded by bolts of fabric in every colour imaginable, feeling more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. The righteous certainty that had propelled him forward was crumbling, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. Doubt? Shame? Fear? He didn't know. He only knew that the world had turned against him, and for the first time he wondered if perhaps they were right. Night fell heavy and oppressive. Karim closed the shop without having made a single sale, and trudged home through streets that seemed darker than usual, as if the town itself had turned away from him. The square where the statue had stood was cordoned off with police tape, flowers and candles piling up around the charred pedestal in an impromptu memorial. He tried not to look, but his feet slowed of their own accord. In the candlelight he could see photographs people had placed at the shrine, wedding pictures, baby announcements, memorial cards for the deceased. All of them had been protected by that statue, blessed by that presence he had called idolatry. A woman he didn't recognize stood vigil there, her face wet with tears. When she saw him, her expression hardened into something that made him hurry away, shame burning in his chest. At home, Aisha had prepared dinner, but the meal was eaten in silence. Ahmed refused to come downstairs. Layla picked at her food, her usual chatter absent. The television remained off. Even the everyday sounds of family life seemed muted, as if the house itself were holding its breath. After the children were in bed, Karim performed his evening prayers with mechanical precision, the words falling from his lips without touching his heart. He made dua for guidance, for vindication, for the community to understand what he had done. But the prayers felt hollow, disappearing into an emptiness that seemed to press down on him from all sides. Sleep would not come. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Aisha's back turned to him, a continent of distance between them despite the mere inches that separated their bodies. Every time he closed his eyes he saw the flames, Mrs. Khoury's face, the empty pedestal, Ahmed's shame, the spray-painted accusation on his shop window. Around midnight he gave up and went downstairs, thinking perhaps some tea would calm his racing thoughts, but as he sat in the kitchen, cradling the warm cup in his hands, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Layla was crying, not the normal tears of a child's nightmare, but gasping, terrified sobs that crescendoed into a scream. He and Aisha both rushed to her room, finding their daughter thrashing in her bed, her small body burning with fever. "Layla! Hayati! What's wrong?" Aisha pressed a hand to the girl's forehead and recoiled at the heat. "Karim, she's on fire. We need to get her to the hospital." The emergency room was a blur of harsh fluorescent lights and anxious waiting. Doctors examined Layla, drew blood, took her temperature repeatedly. 104 degrees, 105. The fever climbed despite medication, despite cold compresses, despite everything the medical staff tried. "We're running tests," the doctor told them, her face professionally calm but her eyes concerned. "But I'll be honest, we're not finding an obvious cause. No signs of infection, no apparent illness. Sometimes children spike fevers like this, and they resolve on their own. But we'll keep her under observation." Karim sat beside his daughter's hospital bed, holding her small hot hand, watching her toss and turn in feverish delirium. Aisha sat on the other side, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry, reciting verses from the Quran in a whisper. "Baba," Layla murmured, her eyes glassy and unfocused. The lady in blue." "What lady, Habibti?" "She's sad, Baba, she's so sad." Layla's voice trailed off into incomprehensible murmurs. Karim looked at Aisha across the bed, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. "Go home," Aisha said quietly. "Check on Ahmed. I'll stay with her." "I should be here." "Go," she repeated, and there was something in her voice that brooked no argument. Karim returned home as dawn was breaking, the streets empty and cold. Ahmed was asleep, or pretending to be. The house felt hollow, haunted by the absence of Layla's bright presence. He tried to pray Fajr, but found himself unable to focus. The words were there, the movements automatic, but his mind kept returning to his daughter's fevered face, her delirious words about a lady in blue. Exhausted beyond measure, he collapsed on the couch, not bothering to go upstairs to the empty bed. Sleep took him suddenly, pulling him down into darkness. And then he was somewhere else entirely. He stood in a vast, barren field under a sky the colour of ash. No sun, no stars, just an endless grey expanse that seemed to press down on him. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and dry, devoid of any living thing. The silence was absolute, more complete than any silence he had ever known. He tried to speak, to call out, but no sound emerged from his throat. Then, at the edge of his vision, he saw movement. A figure approaching across the desolate landscape, moving with a grace that seemed to defy the dead ground beneath her feet. As she drew closer, he saw that she wore robes of deep blue, faded and worn, as if she had been walking for a very long time. Her face was partially veiled, but her eyes were visible, dark and bottomless, and filled with a sorrow so profound that it made his chest ache just to look at her. She stopped a few feet away from him, and Karim found himself falling to his knees without meaning to, some instinct older than thought driving him down. The woman said nothing at first. She simply stood there, regarding him with those ancient, grieving eyes. Then slowly she raised one hand and pointed. Karim followed her gesture and saw scattered at his feet the charred remains of the statue, blackened pieces of cedar, fragments of what had once been a face, hands, robes. The smell of smoke and destruction filled his nostrils, making him gag. He tried to look away, but found he couldn't. The woman's presence held him there, forced him to witness what he had done. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, but it filled the entire grey world. "Understand, a mother's heart." The words struck him like a physical blow. He felt something crack open inside his chest, something he had kept locked away behind walls of certainty and righteousness. Tears began to stream down his face, hot and shameful, and he tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to justify what he had done, but when he opened his mouth no words came out, only a broken sob that echoed across the empty field. The woman in blue watched him cry, her expression unchanged, neither condemning nor forgiving, just witnessing, just bearing the unbearable weight of a mother's grief. And in that moment Karim understood something that shattered every certainty he had ever held. He had not burned a statue, he had burned love itself, he had not defended faith, he had attacked the faithful, he had not preserved purity, he had destroyed peace. The realization was so overwhelming, so completely devastating, that he felt himself coming apart, piece by piece, everything he thought he knew about himself disintegrating like ash in the wind. The woman took one step closer, and he saw that she was weeping too, silent tears running down her veiled face. She reached out as if to touch his head, to offer some gesture of comfort or condemnation. He couldn't tell which. Her fingers were inches from his forehead when he woke with a gasping cry, his face wet with tears, his body trembling so violently that he nearly fell off the couch. The living room was grey with pre-dawn light. His phone was ringing. It was Aisha. "Come back to the hospital," she said, her voice tight with panic. "Layla's fever is spiking again. They're talking about a spinal tap. Karim, I'm scared. She keeps asking for the lady in blue. She won't stop saying it. What does it mean? What does it mean?" Karim couldn't answer. His voice was gone, stolen by the dream that felt more real than any waking moment of his life. He stumbled to his car, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of tears and half-formed prayers, the woman's words echoing in his mind with every heartbeat. Understand, a mother's heart. And for the first time in his life, Karim Al-Fahd felt the terrible weight of what he had done pressing down on him, and he knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Karim ran through them, his footsteps echoing off sterile walls, until he burst into Layla's room to find a scene that stopped his heart. His daughter lay motionless, her small body hooked to monitors that beeped with urgent insistence. Her fever had reached 106 degrees. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her bed, speaking in the clipped, efficient tones of professionals facing a crisis they didn't fully understand. Aisha stood against the wall, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" Karim demanded, his voice raw. The head physician, Dr. Mansour, turned to him with grave eyes. "Mr. Al-Fahd, your daughter's fever is not responding to any medication. We've ruled out the usual causes: bacterial infection, viral infection, appendicitis, meningitis. Her blood work is inexplicably normal, yet her temperature keeps climbing. We're doing everything we can, but I'll be honest with you. If we can't bring this fever down soon, we risk brain damage." The words hit Karim like a physical assault. Brain damage. His bright, beautiful Layla, who loved to draw pictures of flowers and asked 1,000 questions about everything, whose laughter was like sunlight. He moved to his daughter's bedside, taking her burning hand in his. Her skin was so hot it almost hurt to touch. Her eyes were half open but unfocused, moving behind her lids as if she were watching something no one else could see. "The lady," she whispered, her voice cracked and small. "Mama, the lady in blue wants to come home. She's cold, Mama. She's standing in the cold." Aisha's sob cut through the room. "What is she talking about? Karim, what does she mean?" But Karim knew, in the marrow of his bones, In the deepest chamber of his heart, he knew exactly what his daughter was seeing. Dr. Mansour was saying something about a cooling blanket, about transferring to intensive care, but Karim couldn't hear him anymore. The room seemed to tilt and spin, the beeping monitors fading into a distant buzz. Understand a mother's heart, a mother watching her child suffer, a mother's grief at her son's death, a mother's endless compassion for the lost and broken. He had destroyed a symbol of that love, called it idolatry, burned it to ash in a fit of prideful certainty, and now his own child was burning. The connection was impossible, irrational, completely at odds with everything he believed about cause and effect, about divine will, about the order of the universe, and yet he knew it was true. "I have to go," he said suddenly, stumbling backward from the bed. "What? Karim, you can't leave now." Aisha grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. "I have to make this right," he said, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears, hollowed out and ancient. I destroyed something, Aisha. I destroyed something precious, and I have to..." He couldn't finish the sentence. He pulled free from her grasp and ran from the room, ignoring her cries, ignoring the startled looks from the medical staff, ignoring everything except the terrible knowledge that his daughter was paying the price for his pride. The sun was just beginning to rise as he reached the town square, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed like a mockery of beauty. The police tape was still there, the memorial growing larger by the hour. Someone had erected a simple wooden cross with Layla's name on it. No, not Layla. Mary. The name was Mary. The charred pedestal stood empty and accusing in the morning light. Karim fell to his knees before it, not caring that he was in a public space, not caring who might see him, not caring about anything except the unbearable weight crushing his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the words tore from his throat like shards of glass. "Ya Allah, I'm sorry. I was so certain, so absolutely certain I was right. I thought I was defending you, protecting the purity of faith, but I was only defending my own pride, my own need to be right, to be the one who saw clearly when everyone else was blind." The tears came then, hot and bitter, running down his face and soaking into his beard. He bent forward until his forehead touched the stone at the base of the pedestal, the posture of prostration, of complete surrender. "I burned her," he sobbed. "I burned this symbol of love and mercy and compassion, and I called it righteousness. I hurt people who had done nothing but try to find comfort in their faith. I destroyed something beautiful because I was too arrogant to see that beauty can exist in forms I don't understand." A small crowd was beginning to gather, people on their way to work stopping to stare at the sight of Karim Al-Fahd, the man who had burned the statue, now prostrate before its empty pedestal, weeping like a broken child. He didn't care. Let them see. Let them witness the complete dissolution of his pride, the shattering of every certainty that had carried him through his life. "My daughter is dying," he whispered to the stone, to the ashes, to whatever presence might still linger in this place. "My Layla is burning with fever, and I know... Allah forgive me. I know it's because of what I did. Please, please, if there is any mercy in this world, any compassion, any love, save her. Take my life instead. Let me burn. Let me suffer. But please, please, let my daughter live." The words poured out of him in Arabic, in English, in a desperate mixture of both, a prayer that transcended language and theology and every wall he had ever built between himself and the divine mystery. He didn't know how long he knelt there. Time seemed to stop, or perhaps to become irrelevant. The morning sun climbed higher, the crowd grew larger. Someone called Father Elias, someone else called Imam Hassan. But Karim remained on his knees, his body shaking with sobs, his heart cracked wide open, every defence stripped away until all that remained was a father's desperate love and a man's crushing shame. "I was wrong," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "I was so catastrophically wrong, and I don't know how to make it right. I don't know if I can ever make it right, but I swear, by everything I hold sacred, I will try. I will spend the rest of my life trying." A hand touched his shoulder, gentle but firm. He looked up through his tears to see Father Elias standing over him, the priest's weathered face lined with an expression Karim couldn't quite read. "Come," Father Elias said quietly. "Let's talk." Karim allowed himself to be pulled to his feet, his legs weak and trembling. The crowd parted as the priest led him away from the square, toward the cool shadows of St. Anthony's Church, and in a hospital room across town, At that exact moment, Layla's fever began, impossibly, inexplicably, to drop. The interior of St. Anthony's Church was cool and dim, light filtering through stained glass windows to paint the floor in pools of colour. Karim had never been inside a church before. He had always avoided them, considering them places of error at best, idolatry at worst. Now, standing in the nave, he felt small and humbled, like a child encountering something vast and incomprehensible. Father Elias led him to a pew near the front and sat down, gesturing for Karim to join him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the soft rustle of Father Elias's robes as he settled himself. "You came seeking forgiveness," the priest finally said, his voice gentle. "Yes," Karim whispered. I don't know what I need, but my daughter is sick, and I know," his voice broke, "I know it's my fault. Everything is my fault." Father Elias regarded him with eyes that had seen much suffering and offered much comfort over his 70 years. "Tell me about your daughter." So Karim did. The words spilled out of him. Layla's fever, her delirium, her whispers about the lady in blue. He told the priest about his dream, the barren field, the woman who had pointed to the ashes, and whispered those terrible transformative words. "Understand a mother's heart." When he finished, Father Elias sat in silence for a long while, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Do you know," the priest finally said, "that Mary is deeply honoured in Islam? The Quran speaks of her with such tenderness, such reverence. There is an entire surah named for her. She is called Sayyidatuna Maryam, the Lady Mary, mother of Isa, peace be upon them both." Karim nodded, shame burning in his chest. "I know. I've read those verses countless times, but I convinced myself that honouring her as a righteous woman was different from what I saw in that statue. I convinced myself that Christians were committing shirk, making her into something divine when she was only human. And now I understand that I was seeing only what I wanted to see. I was looking for heresy instead of devotion. I was judging form instead of recognizing spirit." Karim's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I destroyed something beautiful because I was afraid of it, because it challenged my certainty, because admitting that others might find God in ways I don't understand would mean admitting that I don't have all the answers." Father Elias placed a hand on Karim's shoulder. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give, my son. Mrs. Corey tends that shrine, the families who place their hopes and sorrows at Mary's feet. Their hurt is their own to carry or release. I cannot absolve you of what you've done." Karim's heart sank. "Then what can I do?" "You can grow into forgiveness," the priest said, echoing Imam Hassan's words from the day before. "You can become a man worthy of it, not through a single act, but through the patient work of years, through humility, through service, through building what you destroyed." "Tell me how," Karim pleaded. "Tell me where to start." Father Elias stood and walked to a small office at the side of the church, returning with a folder of papers. "The Archdiocese has commissioned a new statue, but there's so much more to be done. The pedestal needs cleaning, restoration. The flowers need tending. The site needs someone to care for it day after day until trust can begin to grow again." He handed the folder to Karim. "I cannot promise the community will accept your help. Many are still angry, and rightfully so. But if you're sincere, if you're willing to show up every day, regardless of how you're received, then perhaps, slowly, very slowly, hearts might soften." Karim clutched the folder like a lifeline. "I'll do it. Whatever needs to be done, I'll do it. Then start tomorrow, before dawn. Clean the site, tend the memorial, and be prepared for rejection. Be prepared for anger. Be prepared to serve without thanks or recognition, because that's what true repentance looks like." Before Karim could respond, his phone rang. Aisha's name flashed on the screen. His hand shook as he answered. "Karim!" His wife's voice was thick with tears, but something had changed in it. "Her fever, it broke 5 minutes ago. Just dropped. The doctors are calling it spontaneous recovery. They're running more tests. But Karim," she opened her eyes. She looked at me. "She's asking for water." Karim's legs gave out. He sank back onto the pew, the phone pressed to his ear, Father Elias's steadying hand on his back. "I'm coming," he managed to say. "I'm coming right now." He stood on unsteady legs and turned to Father Elias. "Thank you," he said, inadequate words for the lifeline he had been thrown. The priest nodded. "Go to your daughter. And Karim? What happened to her? I don't claim to understand the mysteries of suffering and healing, "But I do know this. You've been given a second chance, not just with your daughter, but with your own soul. Don't waste it." Karim ran from the church, back through the brightening morning, toward the hospital where his daughter was waking from the darkness that had nearly claimed her. In the weeks that followed, Karim kept his promise. Every morning, before dawn broke over the town, he arrived at the square with cleaning supplies and fresh flowers. He scrubbed the pedestal until the stone gleamed. He pulled weeds from the cracks in the pavement. He organised the memorial items with careful reverence, reading the names and prayers people had left, holding their grief and hopes in his heart. At first people turned away when they saw him. Some spat on the ground as they passed. Others shouted insults or warnings to stay away. Mrs. Curie, when she arrived to find him tending the site, stood frozen for a full minute before wordlessly turning and walking away, her back rigid with unresolved anger. Karim accepted it all without defence or excuse. He simply kept showing up, kept working, kept serving in silence. His shop remained empty. The eviction notice stood. He sold fabric online to make ends meet, working late into the night after his hours at the square. Aisha found work as a seamstress. Ahmed slowly returned to school, bearing the weight of his father's actions with the teenager's complicated mixture of shame and reluctant respect. And Layla recovered completely. The doctors remained baffled by both her sudden illness and her equally sudden recovery, but Karim didn't need their explanations. He knew what had happened, what grace had been extended, what terrible cost had nearly been exacted for his pride. In the quiet hours of his early morning vigil at the square, Karim began to study. He borrowed books from Father Ilyas, downloaded articles, watched lectures. He read about Mary and the Quran with fresh eyes, seeing for the first time the extraordinary honour given to her in his own tradition. He learned that she is mentioned more times in the Quran than in the entire New Testament, that she is the only woman named in the Islamic holy book, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had called her one of the 4 greatest women who ever lived. He read Surah Maryam, the 19th chapter of the Quran, and wept at the tenderness with which it described her trial and her faith. He discovered that Muslims and Christians alike revered her as a symbol of purity, devotion, and surrender to the divine will. How had he missed this? How had he transformed this shared reverence into division? How had his certainty blinded him to the beauty of interfaith connection? One morning, 3 weeks into his daily ritual, Mrs. Corey arrived earlier than usual and found him carefully arranging a bouquet of white roses someone had left the night before. She stood at a distance, watching him work. He felt her presence, but didn't turn around, didn't speak, simply continued his task with the careful attention it deserved. "Why roses?" she finally asked, her voice sharp but curious. Karim turned slowly, his hands still holding the flowers. "Someone left them. They felt appropriate. Roses for purity, for love." He paused, gathering courage. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. If you'd prefer different flowers—" "White roses were her favourite," Mrs. Curie interrupted, her voice cracking slightly. "My mother's favourite. I used to bring them to her grave every week, and then I started bringing them here too. To Mary. Because I felt like she understood what it meant to lose someone you love." She took a step closer, her eyes searching his face. "My son died young, Mr. Al-Fahd, 23 years old, a car accident. For 20 years I've come to this statue and talked to her about him, about my pain, about how hard it is to keep living when part of your heart is buried in the ground." Karim felt tears burning behind his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Curie, for your loss, and for destroying something that gave you comfort. I have no excuse. I was blind and arrogant and cruel." She studied him for a long moment, and he saw the war playing out across her weathered face, anger warring with something that might have been the first glimmer of compassion. "You hurt me," she said simply. "You hurt all of us." "I know. My husband says I should never forgive you. My priest says forgiveness is a commandment, not a suggestion. I'm somewhere in between." She reached out and took the roses from his hands, their fingers briefly touching. "But I see you here every morning. I see the work you're doing, and I wonder if maybe Mary is teaching both of us something." She turned and placed the roses carefully at the base of the pedestal, then stood in silence for a moment, her lips moving in quiet prayer. When she was finished, she looked back at him. "You can stay," she said. "But you work with me, not alone. I won't have the memorial disrespected by carelessness, even unintentional. Understood?" "Yes, Ma'am," Karim said, his voice thick with gratitude and relief. From that day forward, they worked side by side. Mrs. Corey taught him which flowers bloomed in which seasons, which families visited on which days, the stories behind the photographs and prayer cards left at the shrine. She spoke to him about her son, about her faith, about the Virgin Mary, as a mother who understood grief. And Karim listened, really listened, without judgment or theological critique, simply receiving her words as the precious gifts they were. Other members of the community began to notice the change. Father Elias visited regularly, often bringing lunch for both Karim and Mrs. Curie, staying to talk about scripture and faith and the hard work of reconciliation. Imam Hassan came too, proudly watching his congregation, member walk the difficult path of atonement. "You're becoming a bridge, Arki," the Imam told him one afternoon, "between our communities, between pride and humility, between who you were and who you're becoming." The new statue was completed after 6 weeks. The artist had created something beautiful, Mary, with her arms outstretched, her face serene, her robes flowing as if caught in a gentle wind. It was carved from marble this time, not cedar, built to last, to endure, to withstand whatever trials might come. The dedication ceremony was planned for a Sunday afternoon. Every church in town would be represented. The mayor would speak. It would be a moment of healing, of restoration, of community coming together after trauma. The night before the ceremony, Karim couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with doubts and fears. Would his presence at the ceremony be welcomed, or would it poison the healing? Should he stay away, let the community celebrate without the reminder of what had been destroyed? "You should go," Aisha said softly in the darkness. She had been distant for weeks, working through her own anger and disappointment, but slowly, as she watched him rise before dawn each morning, as she saw him return home exhausted but determined, something had begun to thaw between them. "What if I ruin it?" he whispered. "What if you're supposed to be there?" she countered. "What if your presence, your testimony to change, is part of the healing?" He turned to face her in the dark. "Do you forgive me? For the shame I brought on our family? For the fear I caused Layla?" Aisha was quiet for a long moment. "I'm working on it," she finally said, "just like you're working on becoming better. Forgiveness isn't a moment, Karim. It's a journey. And we're both still walking." She reached across the space between them and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him with tenderness in weeks. "Go tomorrow," she said. "Bear witness to what you've learned. That's all you can do."